Buongiorno a tutti, grazie per essere venuti. Oggi è un giorno davvero importante per la nostra università, sia per il tema di cui ci occuperemo oggi, anzi grazie alla professoressa Wolf, è un tema davvero straordinario, quello che riguarda la qualità dell'insegnamento. È importante la scienza, è importante la didattica, è importante anche la qualità del trasferimento dalla scienza alla didattica. Comunque se ne parlerà più diffusamente dopo e non ho l'ardire di entrare nel merito dell'evento di oggi. Però ruberò 5 minuti ai nostri distinti ospiti accademici e alla professoressa Wolf che ha dedicato tanto tempo all'organizzazione di questo evento per parlare un po' della nostra università, anche attraverso delle immagini. Aspetta un attimo. Stiamo crescendo parecchio, anche questo luogo l'abbiamo costruito in poche settimane, siamo al 5° edificio, stiamo cercando di realizzare delle sedi distaccate in Italia e spesso mi chiedono ma chi c'hai dietro? Chi c'è dietro Ricavillus? È una domanda molto frequente, io rispondo in modo abbastanza furbesco dicendo dietro nessuno, sopra. Dico, guardano il dito e chi c'è sopra? San Camillo, dico, è così. Però no, la verità è che quello che c'è dietro siete tutti voi perché è il network delle grandi eccellenze scientifiche e accademiche che siamo riusciti con un po' di fortuna a mettere insieme. Quindi io credo che quello che c'è dietro è quello che c'è dentro questa stanza, quest'aula, che veramente arricchisce, anima la qualità della nostra università. Quindi io vi ringrazio davvero di cuore e vorrei dedicarvi per la prima volta da questa parte a voi un applauso. Complimenti, grazie. Eppure è raro che ci si veda, che si stia tutti insieme perché si vede il contratto eccetera, poi si vede l'orario in segreteria, si va a fare lezione, poi si va a fare esame, che si stia tutti insieme non è frequente. Quindi l'occasione di oggi in realtà vuole inaugurare, non preoccupatevi, non ne faremo moltissimi, ma 3, 4, 5 durante l'anno di networking, di occasioni in cui ci si conosce, chi è, com'è. Ecco, probabilmente è altrettanto importante, professoressa Wolf, non me ne voglia, il momento del caffè che ci sarà dopo, quando poi saremo insieme, si chiacchiererà, ci scambieremo, ma lo dico davvero con tanto affetto, in cui scambieremo le nostre impressioni, ci scambieremo i numeri, cosa va, eccetera, e poi magari qualcuno fisserà col professor Gallucci, dove sta, quelli della mia età, qualche appuntamento successivo. Vabbè, comunque, è un momento senz'altro importante che riguarda la capacità della nostra università di fare network. C'è un ulteriore elemento che riguarda la capacità strutturale dell'università, di cui siamo veramente, veramente orgogliosi. Fra qualche giorno andremo a fare una visita presso una sede distaccata molto lontana da Roma, a cui stiamo lavorando da qualche tempo, che forse sarà un ulteriore fiore all'occhiello della nostra università, e ci diranno ma qui non c'è nulla, c'è un ospedale, eccetera, ma l'università. E noi diremo, l'università la costruiremo in poco tempo, ma ce la fate in un anno? No, gli diremo, noi ce la faremo in 3 mesi. Dice, non ci posso credere, e invece dovete crederci. Prego, vi faremo vedere questo video. Prima o poi la professoressa Tavazzi e il professor Lazzarino, che non so perché vengono sempre catturati e infilati dentro il video, anche quello che sta andando in onda sulle serie, ci chiederanno il diritto d'immagine. Insieme anche al bravissimo studente giapponese, che non so perché deve essere particolarmente, ce lo infilano sempre, ma insomma, questo anche dopo laureato. Siamo contenti per il Giappone perché siamo arrivati a 7 giapponesi. No, il numero degli studenti internazionali continua a crescere in modo veramente spaventoso. Ieri abbiamo consegnato le pergamene del master in odontoiatria, non so che cosa, a una ventina di coreani che sono venuti da tutto il mondo, perché erano coreani non della Corea del Sud, originari della Corea del Sud, in una diaspora strana, perché c'erano canadesi coreani, americani coreani, francesi coreani, sono tutti a Roma. La cosa ci ha fatto particolarmente piacere, non so se avete visto le immagini su Facebook, ma è una cosa che sottolinea senz'altro questo elemento a cui siamo molto affezionati, quello dell'internazionalizzazione. L'internazionalizzazione che oggi è testimoniata anche dal panel dei nostri ospiti. Io non porto via altro tempo alla professoressa Wolf, che da par suo adesso presenterà il vero oggetto, il tema del nostro convegno, ed esprimo ancora una volta la piena gratitudine per il tempo che è dedicato all'organizzazione di questo evento, di cui siamo ancora una volta particolarmente orgogliosi. Grazie professoressa Wolf.
Grazie chiarissimo Rettore, perché il suo entusiasmo è contagioso e questo è un elemento secondo me fondamentale dell'essere qui e di impegnarsi sempre di più nel lavorare per l'Unicamillus. Ora parlerò in inglese perché abbiamo degli ospiti stranieri e soprattutto perché siamo una international medical school e quindi è d'obbligo utilizzare la lingua internazionale, la lingua scientifica. So, ladies and gentlemen, colleagues and friends, welcome to the first meeting on medical education. In particular, I am grateful to our prestigious guests that came to visit us and will make this meeting a really special event. Unicamillus is a young medical and health science school willing to take an important place among Italian and international medical education academy. Unicamillus opened in 2018 with few bachelor courses and grew exponentially, maybe even more rapidly than the building you have seen just on the pictures on the movie, and grew exponentially in the number of courses, bachelor, master, and one cycle courses, and in the number of students. Currently, we have 2,662 enrolled students, 1,756 medical students, of which 13.6% are extra-EU, 197 odontostomatology students, and 719 bachelor course students. Overall, the extra-EU students accounts for 22% of the total population. This number will further grow due to the incoming first-year medical students, which will be more than 600. And this is the very last challenge we are going to face. This year, we will have the first cohort of medical school graduates. We look forward to this important achievement. We are recruiting our dedicated academic staff, which will be engaged in teaching and research. Among the teachers, we have some senior, me for instance, and many junior academics. An ideal situation to build up an effective and stimulating teaching community sensible to the advances of modern medical education. In the face of current technologies, allowing every individual to access to medical and scientific literature, and the amazing rate of growing information, as educators, we need to focus on the most effective way to guide our students to learn and to apply medical science. What and how to teach our students, how to take advantage of IT to improve teaching and practicing. Our guest from Netherlands and UK, prestigious member of AME, the Association of Medical Education, in Europe first, but then it became international, global, with meetings accounting for thousands of participants, will point out the key features of the modern medical schools that have been implemented in Northern Europe and that inspired the European guidelines for harmonizing higher education and professional recognition. Our stakeholders are the students. But do we really know and understand the current generation of students? Who are they, what they expect from us, how they react, how they learn? I could say especially after the COVID restriction and the lockdown, because they are back, but somehow we feel that they are a little different. This experience changed themselves, and also because some of them during the higher school, they experienced the lockdown and the online teaching. Finally, so Professor Famigliari, a senior member of the Italian Society for Medical Education, which is the mentor of Sapienza students, will tell us about the main characteristic of the current generation of medical students, what they expect from us. Needless to say that as educators, we need to adapt our teaching to their characteristics. Finally, Professor Amanda Murphy from the Center of Higher Education Internationalization of Catholic University will underline two additional issues: teaching in English to international, multicultural classes, providing clues to manage some unprecedented situations. I strongly hope this short introductory meeting will stimulate interest, curiosity, and enthusiasm to most of us, from the newly appointed academics to the more expert teachers. I hope we will be inspired to learn more, to engage ourselves in improving the effectiveness of our teaching with the objective of improving students' education, to make Unicamillus an outstanding medical school. Thank you very much. Just 1 second. Now I give the place to our distinguished guest. First of all, Professor Olle Tenkate. Olle Tenkate is an emeritus professor of medical education at University of Medical Center Utrecht, Netherlands, and adjunct professor to the University of California, San Francisco. So he exported his knowledge to the US. After medical school and PhD in social science, he served for decades at the University of Amsterdam and Utrecht, contributing to the curriculum innovation, educational research, and faculty development in health professions education, locally, nationally, and internationally. He founded and led the Center for Research and Development of Education at University Medical Center Utrecht, was president of the Netherlands Association of Medical Education, and published and presented more than 500 papers, mentored PhD students, and has a long collection of awards. I am very grateful to Olle, with whom I shared some European projects, to be here, to be at Unicamillus, and I give you the podium.
Thank you very much, Federica. We've been friends for many years, so I'm happy to be here, and thank you very much for the invitation. Yes, here we go. I have a lot to say, and I have about half an hour, so let's buckle up and speed up with talking about the advances in medical education. And my background is already known. I'm also a member of AMI, of the International Association, so I'll say a few words about that too. Aggiornamento software. I'm not sure what this means here. Okay, all right. So where do we come from? Let's start with a little bit of history. So very long time ago, education looked like this. And you could see actually people are very, very interactive on a personal level and a little bit with groups level. But across a while, of course, the number of students increased and the number of teachers did not increase as fast. So what we needed was lectures like this. And you can see that that's a very old picture from Bologna University from your country. In the 11th century, there's many pupils, a few teachers, so lectures were needed to do that. And you can already see that principles of active learning started to erode, maybe in Bologna already. But if you think of it, like lectures, we're sitting in a hall, and for some purposes, it may be excellent to be with a large number of people listening to a single teacher. Sometimes it could be a unique situation. But think of this, we have been doing this since the 11th century, and we're still doing that. And now, specifically with the ubiquitous access to information that we have since the turn of the millennium, everybody has internet, and it's quickly expanding. The scale of lectures are maybe becoming somewhat less functional, having so many people sit down in a lecture, listen to a person talking for an hour. So that's a little bit about education, and I'll switch back and forth with education and medicine. So here's medicine. So if you think of it, until about 150 years ago, we had two types of physicians in many countries. One type of physician would be the university-educated scholar, and in scholarly terms, became a doctor. A doctor is actually a scholarly degree. So university medical education was very theoretical, hardly any practical training or in clinical medicine. At the other side of the scale, you would see barber surgeons being trained in the streets, just doing practice work all the time. They became better and better too when they start organizing themselves in guilds. But it took quite a while, and actually about 150 years ago, when governments, it was in my country and many other countries too, decided that every physician should have both theoretical background and practical training. So they were glued together from, I would say, mid-19th century. So how has that actually evolved? And let's give just one example of education in my country, medical education in my country. When we started, like before 1865, because that was, in my country, the time that legislation for medical education started. Of course, before that time, we had separate education, and when people were ready, they were ready for practice. And I would say make a big jump to about around 1940, I would say, is where of course, for a number of decades, we had that uniformed education with practical training and theoretical background. And some people started doing postgraduate training and being licensed for practice on a higher level. So those dotted lines, red and yellow, would be licensed to practice, or the ability, the permission to practice medicine. And in the 1980s, you could see that expanded further. By that time, just in my country, just about everyone goes to postgraduate training. We actually, in 1980, we have no actual license to practice unsupervised just for medical school anymore. So we do have a license, but you have to work under supervision. So only after postgraduate training you would be allowed to work unsupervised. And then even further, we started developing, and you can see something happening in these colors in the bottom there, green and orange. There's something is switching a little bit, and I'll explain that in the next slide. But finally, we're ending around this time with education that has specific phases of transition to practice, both after medical school and after postgraduate training with fellowships. So let me explain that shift in direction a little bit. We call that sometimes a shift from curricula that are H-shaped to curricula that are Z-shaped. Now, an H-shaped curriculum means there is a number of years, could be 3 years, 4 years, 5 years of basically all theoretical training, and suddenly a step to clinical training. You're immersed in a clinical practice. So what we're seeing now in the recent decades is that curricula are shifting towards a more, I would say, integrated, vertically integrated model. And vertical integration means that there is clinical training from a very early phase that gradually expands over time. And there's basic science teaching that is much more in connection with clinical practice, and that actually decreases over time. So learning in the workplace then is not just clinical knowledge acquisition, but it's more than learning. It is also learning to bear that clinical responsibility step by step, not just teaching, and it's not just acquiring knowledge and skills, but it's also becoming a doctor, which is also professional identity and also responsibility for patient care. By the end of our medical school and postgraduate training, we want people not just to have knowledge and skills, but we want them to be ready to practice unsupervised. So let me give an example of in one curriculum, and that I'll use my own curriculum, what that looks like. The Utrecht Undergraduate Medical Education, and if you actually flip it a little bit from the previous slide, you go from bottom to top, from undergraduate, from top to bottom actually, from basic science teaching in rather theoretical classroom teaching in block periods of about 6 weeks. And then after a while, you can see colors coming up. So after those integrated block courses in those early years, we started, and with longitudinal threads in between, like 1 day a week, they would do clinical training, like clinical reasoning training or practical clinical skills training. And then from the third year, there would be 12-week full-time clerkships preceded by a preparatory classroom block in year 3, 4, 5, and 6. So the last bachelor year and 3 years of the master course. So that is very much integrated, and it's also very much focused on your next phase of clinical education in these domains is preceded by a block that really provides you with everything you need to be very efficient in your clinical training. We also employ something that is called Entrustable Professional Activities, EPAs, and I'll explain that word later in a few slides. And we do that actually in those clinical clerkships, of which all last 12 weeks and are integrated too. I can't go, because of the time, too much on the details of that integration. But the final year is actually a final year of medical school that students have significantly higher level of responsibility. So we build that up. We don't call them medical students anymore. We call them semi-physicians. And the semi-physicians take care of a limited number of not too complex patients. It's their own responsibility. They are the primary care provider for those patients. We do that in the final year. And we have built that up because of the responsibilities they have learned to acquire in earlier years. So that's a little bit about developments in medical curricula. So let's go back a little bit to education in general. So what are general principles of education that we know are evidence-based? Learning builds always on prior knowledge. And everybody, like you are sitting here, you have a wealth of prior knowledge in your mind. And everything that I say to you might land well. I just talked to somebody who said, I've read your literature. And he may listen different to my talk than the ones who have never thought about education yet. So there's differences, and that holds for medical students too, and for any students. Think of that when you teach. A connection with prior knowledge must be meaningful. So you can deliberately do something with that to stir up prior knowledge that people already have and then connect new information to that. Students' motivation is important. It directs their learning. Mastery of complex skills is important, that there's learning components. They must be integrated together, and then they must be applied. If you never apply that, it will not stick. So that's another evidence-based principle. And then goal-directed practice with targeted feedback is effective. So feedback that is really specific on what students need to learn in a next step. So that's important. Then social, emotional, and intellectual climate affects learning. The ones that you are interacting with, your peers, your teachers, the clinical environment, clinicians around you, nurses maybe, and other people, they are much more important for your development and learning than many people would think. And then self-monitoring skills are important, and being have a responsive attitude that affects learning. So that is something that students themselves must realize and learn, that they have to think about their own knowledge acquisition, and they could do that in peers, they can test each other, but they have to develop a sense of where am I, what do I know, what are next steps for me. So in all of that, active learning is shown to be much more productive than passive consumption. I'll come back to that too. So here's again something specific about medical education. So in the 1980s, this was a model that was presented, and I always like to name that model because the model is still functional. If you think of the development of your own education, think of something that is called SPICES, the SPICES model. And if you compare what has been called traditional medical education and modern medical education, it's a move from teacher-centered education to student-centered education, from information-based only to problem-based, from discipline-based to integrated, from hospital-based also to community-based, to from a curriculum that is uniform in all respects for everyone, to a curriculum that has electives that are parts of the curriculum that students can choose themselves, and from opportunistic clinical training, just be there in a clinical space and whatever happens, you might learn from or might not learn from, to a more systematic approach to clinical teaching. So about active learning, and I just inserted this slide yesterday because I got an email from the YIDAN organization that actually said, this model, and I'll explain the ICAP model, the inventor of the model just received the 2023 YIDAN Prize, which almost sounds like a Nobel Prize for Education Research. I think it's along with like $6 million is what they get, and so, and it's actually because to celebrate what Professor Mickey Chi has actually achieved, and one of her central parts of her research has been to show with evidence how important it is that active learning actually happens, and the model actually says there is different modes of teaching and different modes of learning also then too, is passive, active, constructive, and interactive. And those letters start with P-A-C-I, and if you move that around, you have that word ICAP. That's the ICAP model. It is actually moving from receiving information only to manipulating information in your mind, to do something with that information, to generate new ideas, and to dialogue with other people about those ideas. And I'm not going to go into details of all of this slide because we don't have all time for it, but what Mickey Chi actually showed in a whole series of studies, that interactive learning is actually the most effective way of doing things, of remembering information. Of course, you must acquire that, but if you don't interact, it will not stick easily. So ways to do that is approaches that are sometimes called flipped classroom. So one way of traditional teaching is that everybody sits in a lecture hall like this, receives new information, goes home, starts to study that, repeat that. As soon as they start coming with problems or questions, there's no teaching anymore because the teaching was already done. So a flipped classroom, say, why don't we flip that around? We have now modern approaches so that teaching does not have to be in a lecture hall. You could actually do that online. If you have high level and high quality products to do that, you could actually study that. You could read and you could watch a person talk and then come together when there's a teacher and then work together to solve those problems. There is a very specific approach that's called team-based learning, and I really like to recommend that approach because it has been highly successful. So what happens? There's pre-class preparations. Students must do that, and you know that they do that because they have to take a personal test. That's an individual test, sometimes called an IRET, Individual Readiness Assurance Test. They take that test. Then they come to school. And if they are coming to school, they're not listening to a lecture. They're sitting in a group of peers that all did that same test. And now they're coming up with the team answers to those same test questions. So they have to discuss as a team, they have to argue, they have to interact with each other to come up with the best answers. And then they take the test again as a team, as a group. And now only after that time, there is interaction with the teacher. And the teacher interaction leads to resolving questions that the teams or the groups or the individuals still are working with. So there's not much like a regular old-fashioned lecture, but it's really an interactive lesson. And then actually that is basically towards the closure of that procedure. So it's just an idea to get you somewhere. Let's go back to medical education again. So the birth of postgraduate education on that same timeline was actually around 1920. So we're focusing now a little more on clinical training. And as I said, so in the 19th century, the licensed physicians became were supposed to be ready for all of general practice. But around 1920, people would say, well, actually, most students need to be more, actually, for a longer time in a clinical space. That could be an intern year, or it could be even longer, and that's what the start of postgraduate training was actually established in Johns Hopkins University. That's known for that. So there's where residency started. And residency in postgraduate training actually means a resident is a person who lives somewhere, right? So a residency training means that there's persons living in the hospital, almost 24/7 being there. And the idea at that time was, if you do that for a number of years, we will qualify you as a specialist in training. That's what Hopkins, William Osler, William Halstead in internal medicine and surgery said. So just remember the idea of there's a fixed duration in training, and after that, we just assume that you have everything you need to be a specialist, because I will challenge that assumption. So before we go a little further, we're taking up history of all. This is a famous pyramid, and it's called the Pyramid of Miller. And the Pyramid of Miller actually says, how do we know that students are ready for practice? We need to know whether they have knowledge, right? So we have to have knowledge exams. Or we need to know that they can apply that knowledge. And then we need to know that they can integrate that knowledge with clinical skills. Which means that we have to have some sort of skills test. And then finally, we just want to know whether in practice, in true patient care, they will actually do well. So that's the DOS level of Miller's pyramid. So again, starting with written questions like MCQs and constructed response tests, and then standardized performance tests in simulated situations, and then finally, workplace-based assessment. Here and that, the workplace-based assessment has been in the last 2 decades has an enormous amount of interest in the literature. You can see a lot about that, and it started to actually be called more phases of competency-based education. It was called the advance in the next advance in graduate education, or a paradigm shift from Flexner to competencies. And the critical thing was, I remember that I said something about that fixed length of experience, clinical experience, that was challenged. But people said, what if at the end of that fixed period of training, people would not actually be at that point that they should be? We don't really know if we don't test them, and we don't really know if we have not targeted education. So instead of thinking of a fixed period of time and then just assuming that everybody's ready, going to a variable, with variable outcomes, going to fixed outcomes, so the outcomes are most important. And then and then we look at the time. Maybe some people need more time. They must have more time, maybe. Or if they are very fast, they might even complete that earlier. So the idea of competency-based education challenged the idea of a fixed period of clinical training. So that's actually what competency-based medical education is. The question is, when is a doctor competent enough to work without supervision? When does a doctor deserve to be licensed to practice? And would that be that same moment be the same for all trainees and for all professional activities and responsibilities? Let me give one example. Here is the training of colonoscopy. Colonoscopy requires a lot of training under direct supervision. And direct supervision means there must be somebody in the room who actually guides you. So some learners might be ready for unsupervised practice after 100 of attempts under supervision. Others, however, would need 200 attempts, or still others would need 300 attempts. So actually you can see, and this was a simple study doing that there's quite a bit variation between individuals. So if you would think there's a fixed period of time and you're signing off for postgraduate training, just think with every student you are saying you can complete training, would you trust your own loved ones with this trainee? Would you actually, are you really confident that they really meet all critical objectives of your training? And it's an interesting question that we actually posed in an international study in Europe. But I also use that same question for audiences like you. I'm not going to do that here in practice, but you can think of it. If you are in a position as a clinician to sign up for the completion of training, can you remember personally signing off for completion of a program or a training while you were not fully confident that this learner had met all critical objectives? And if I ask that to audiences, and I've done that very many times actually, this is about the result that you would find. 60% or more people can remember that they personally signed up. Why is that? That is because the time is up after 4 years or 5 years, and you don't have very good arguments, but your gut feeling says, and it's a minority of students, but still, your gut feeling says, well, I'm not really confident, but I have no ways to stop that person. And this is actually the reason why we think of competency-based education. Competency-based education is really focused not so much on the question, how much did the student actually do? Did they pass their test? But also, are they truly ready for independent practice? And there might be other things, professionalism things. And just before this talk, we were talking about an incident that you may read about in the news this evening. If you're looking at the news, there was a shooting happening in Rotterdam yesterday or the day before yesterday, and that happened to be a medical student who was about to graduate. He had completed all his assignments, and actually that was stated in the news. He had completed all his assignments, but the school was suspicious about his professional behavior, and they said, we want you to go into a remediation because we worry about your professional behavior. And what happened? He did a terrible shooting yesterday. So people died in that shooting. And that's very unusual in the Netherlands. You hear that stories from the United States, but now it happened in the Netherlands. So we're very worried. But the funny thing is, actually, the atrocious thing is, It was also a medical student. So it exemplifies something very, very exaggerated, I must say that. But somebody who has completed every assignment of your school, are you going to sign them off to be ready for unsupervised practice, or are there other things? Now, this is, of course, a very exaggerated example, but we know of other examples that are actually not, I would say, not infrequent. So the question is here, we're not only looking back, we're not only asking the question, does the student show the mastery of all the assignments that we did, all taught in courses and rotations, but really, is this student ready for the expected future responsibilities? And in the jargon, we call this either an assessment that is focused retrospectively or prospectively. And we're moving gradually to a prospective way of assessment. And one of the elements doing that is a concept that we call entrustable professional activities. The key question with those activities are, do you trust the learner to do this? And the definition is a unit of professional practice. You could see that as a task or responsibility that can be fully entrusted to a trainee once he or she has demonstrated the necessary competence to execute that activity unsupervised. And the purpose is actually to operationalize that competency-based training through a stepwise, safe engagement of trainees in clinical practice with progressive autonomy. We don't want to graduate people who have not shown that they are ready for practice for each of those large responsibilities of units of practice. So just give a very other example that you will understand what an EPA is driving as an EPA, actually. So it's an activity that you would trust a person to do only if they have shown that they have attained their required competencies. And it's a critical activity. Things go, you would never have give permission to a person to do that activity unsupervised if you have not established that they have done so. So providing a driver's license is actually what we would now call it an entrustment decision. So when does that happen in medical school? If you think of the word competent, when is a professional activity mastered at that threshold level that permits for unsupervised practice? And you could just see that's a stage in a development. So this is the development of the student from novice to advanced to competent to proficient and expert. Here is that middle level that we call competent. So famous psychologists in the United States actually devised this, but the word competence is actually in the middle. And that could be that threshold. You could see this student has now developed, and we have closely monitored the student. We know that the student is now ready for unsupervised practice. And you could apply that to one EPA. Or there could be a different task or activity or unit of practice that would be easier. Or still, there's different graphs here. And if you draw that same line of thresholds of ready for unsupervised practice, you could see that's not all the same moment. It's not all on the last day of training. There could be at different moments. And here's where you could create education and a curriculum for stepwise increase of autonomy and increase of becoming a member of the medical community. So, and if you keep on doing that with deliberate practice, your skills will still increase. And we all know that. After school and after postgraduate training, in the early years of being an attending in the hospital is where you learn a lot still. So your skills will further increase, but as long as you practice. If you don't practice, they might even decrease. So there might be a moment that you would say, for this EPA, we once qualified you, but now no longer. Maybe in your re-registration, we should not allow you to do that anymore without supervision. So, and if you think of it, it is not only that we look at unsupervised or supervised, that it could be stages of supervision. So a learner usually starts with being able to observe, are in the clinical space, and then being monitored very closely with close supervision, with indirect supervision, somebody not in the room, but he can step in, or unsupervised. And so those levels of supervisions are important, and also having a space to be able to do things that actually are objectives for the end of training before the end of training, because you want to make sure that they are really ready to have that responsibility. So if you use an EPA-based program, and more schools and programs actually worldwide are starting to use that, it is collecting information by observation of learners, having different EPAs be qualified, and that leads to a license and a diploma. So on a stepwise legitimate participation in healthcare from the periphery until the center of a community of healthcare by step, and EPA by EPA, by observing, acting with direct, indirect supervision, unsupervised. And if anyone wants to learn more about that, we provide courses about EPA, so there's hundreds more things to say about that. Now, a little bit about scholarship and AMY. So health professions education, and that's what I've been doing, that's what Helen Cameron has been doing for many years, and it's actually a whole domain on itself. Just think about, how do you develop education? What do we know about assessment? How can you create curricula? It is a whole a world actually with many journals. I collect journals about medical education. I'm over 100 journals actually that now actually are active in it. There would be like 20 that are really prominent, but there's many more in different countries too. So there's also conferences on health professions education. We usually can name that broader than only medical. So health professions education, like the AMY, like the Ottawa meeting every 2 years, APMAC meeting in the Asian countries. So there's significant advances in teaching and assessment methods. So AMY, the association, and I've been a member of the executive committee of the AMY for a number of years, is the largest international group, has an annual conference but just in Glasgow, where 3,000 people were present. Next year it will be in Basel. If you're really interested in education, think of it, to attend the AMY meeting in Basel in August. Or you can become a member of that, or as an associate fellow or a fellow of AMY, based on your CV and what you have done. So just a few pictures of AMY. There's a website you can go. The website will be renewed. Within 2 months, they will have a completely new website. But this is from the current website. And here's some pictures from the conference. Here, just recent conferences, actually different conferences of AMY. And there's also a lot of small group work, and people will meet. I will meet people that I work with internationally, and we'll sit around the table. We'll have a dinner with. This is the International Competency-Based Medical Education Collaborators Consortium that is having a dinner here. We'll talk about the future of medical education here. So, in conclusion, medical education is not what it was decades ago. Advances are happening rapidly worldwide, and try to connect with that. AMY is a great community to do that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Olle, for all these very interesting inputs. I think we decided to have a general discussion afterwards. So we would like to move on with Helen. Helen Cameron is again an emeritus professor of medical education from the University of Edinburgh Medical School, and she has served at Aston Medical School in the latest year. She's dealing and studying medical education since many years, had a lot of prize and recognition. And so please, I asked Helen to focus on assessment, because we have seen a lot of method for medical education. We have seen a lot of topics, and now I would like her to underline the assessment problems about in medical education. Please, Helen.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for this invitation to come and speak to you. I was particularly interested to get this invitation from Federica, because I've been over 20 years at the University of Edinburgh, but for the last 6.5 I was at Aston Medical School. I set up the programme there, and it was a brand new medical programme, and also creating programmes for physician associates and for nurses. So I think I share some of the thinking and issues that Uni Camillus is facing now. Federica asked me to speak particularly about centres or departments of medical education. And in our discussion time at the end of the afternoon, I'm sure Ole will be able to contribute a great deal more. Edinburgh created what it called its medical teaching organisation in 1996, and it latterly became a centre for medical education. And what drove that to happen? It was actually the publication of the UK General Medical Council's first version of Tomorrow's Doctors, because they required medical schools to deliver integrated programmes, integrated across academic disciplines, across specialties, integrating skills with knowledge from an early stage, and even being interested in our processes of learning. In Edinburgh, we used to have what we would call fiefdoms, groups of individual specialists who would decide their own curriculum and their own assessment. That had to be swept aside. It would have been impossible if we hadn't had a department or a centre for medical education. And really, they've gone on to undertake all the tasks here. And I would particularly emphasise the governance and the quality assurance of the programme and assessment. But also, you need that team of people to be able to see the whole picture and think about how subjects can be integrated over the years and even within 1 year, how they should bring in new topics and skills, undertake scholarship and research, as Ole said earlier. It's really difficult to do that if you're a lone person, but if you've got a group of really interested people, then they can encourage one another, you can have weekly meetings, you can find funding. And of course, if you are going to develop an integrated curriculum, bringing in innovative methods of teaching, you need a group of people to research, to look at the literature, to decide, and then to plan and implement. And the last one is equally important. This centre undertook the personal and professional development of students. So seeing that as an integral part of their education and not just an add-on, and also the continuing professional development of our teachers, so that in the end Edinburgh had developed standalone short courses, journal clubs, but also centre a certificate, a diploma, a master's, and even PhDs in medical education. But now to change tack, really to consider quality assessment, that's what Federica really asked me to speak to you about. I thought I should start with this helpful approach to consider what we mean by quality or good assessment. Over the years, I've found Van der Vluten's statement on the utility of assessment very useful. Is this familiar to people? Just nod or shake. It just helps me to understand where we're all at. No, so that's fine. But if I were to explain that this is not a mathematical equation, but it's a representation of how we might think about the quality of education. And Van der Vluten emphasises these characteristics: the reliability, that is, can you repeat it and get the same results? The validity, does it actually test what you think it's testing? The cost effectiveness, can we afford it? Is it worth it? Acceptability, do students and staff think it's worthwhile and giving accurate results? And what's the educational impact? And latterly, Noshini and others, first of all at the Ottawa conference, which is really an offshoot of AMI, I think it's reasonable to say, one of the AMI supported conferences, looked at what everyone thought was good assessment. And they came up with a very similar framework, but also included equivalence. So do you get similar results if you were to use the same test in another institution or in another year or cycle of the programme? And is there a very positive catalytic effect of the assessment? Does it drive not just the students, but the staff as well to really focus on developing education and learning to improve the programme and to improve the students' outcomes? So these are two, I think, quite useful models to think about how do I begin to work out if this assessment is useful. But it would take me hours to go through all the principles that are linked with these statements. And so, if you'll forgive me, I've decided to focus on the educational impact of assessment and think about which types of assessment or what can we learn from assessment that will positively impact students' learning. We're probably all familiar with the maxim that assessment drives learning. Is that a phrase that's used in Italian medical schools, Italian universities, that assessment actually drives learning? It is true, we'll see it's true, but we've also got to acknowledge that actually humans are innately curious, particularly amongst the young, but also amongst adults. Humans are somewhat unusual in the fact that they hang on to some of their juvenile tendencies of curiosity and playfulness. But I'll return to how assessment may cut across that curiosity and destroy it if we're not careful. So, what are the characteristics of assessment that we should pay attention to if we want to enhance its educational impact? Many would say that we over-assess our students, but Chris McManus and colleagues wrote this interesting paper in 2015 looking at the amount of assessment in UK medical schools and how it related to performance in our graduates' postgraduate exams. And interestingly, those schools that had a lot of undergraduate assessment, summative assessment that counted, not just class tests, but the summative assessment, actually did better in the postgraduate exams. And you can see that range of assessment for medical schools was from 1,000 to 3,000 minutes over the whole programme. I understand this was really quite a surprise to the group because their premise was that some schools were being unfair to their students, over-assessing and disadvantaging them. Frank Leeming did a similar bit of work, but looking at his own class. This is maybe an interesting example of how you can go from multi-institutional research to just research on your own class in your own programme. He was noticing this business of the procrastination scallop, that students don't start learning their work till too late and shoot up their effort in the hope to reach competence, but often failing to do so. So he was thinking, how do I divert students' attention away from other college activities, focus them on their required work? He'd also been aware that modest increases in exams resulted in improved results. So he increased the frequency of his exams to every day, just short 15-minute tests at the beginning of the class. And when he compared their performance with those who had the standard 3 tests per semester, his students who were having the repeated frequent tests did very much better, retained much more information at the end of the year, but also they were happier in the class, fewer of them withdrew from class, and when he asked them their opinion, they approved of this process. In 2013, Raupach compared learning gains with different types of testing and also teaching, and he concluded that summative assessment was much more effective than formative assessment in getting students to really learn the material and retain it. And he also compared that with giving just extra lectures and some innovative teaching, such as peer tutoring. And he found then that, like the group who'd had summative assessment, they spent more time on learning, they used the resources better. But the group that only had extra teaching didn't actually perform better in the exams. And Rowland's meta-analysis in 2014 added to Raupach's findings. Rowland was again looking at the learning gains of teaching versus restudying, and agreed with Raupach, and also concluded that it was probably constructive response questions that were better than selected response questions. So just to be clear, when I say constructed response questions, I mean these short essays, short answer questions, free text, as opposed to selected response questions, which we would use for multiple choice questions, true-false questions, single best answer questions. So those students that had had to undertake constructed response questions actually hung on to that information better and did better at end of term exams. And interesting, in just this month's Medical Teacher, there's a paper by Brenner and others looking at a survey of students and staff in 3 US medical schools. And they were asked about their perceived educational value of constructed response questions, and their findings accord with Rowland's. So let's pause for a minute and just summarise what I've been saying. The amount of summative assessment seems to correlate with learning gain. Now, whether that's frequency or large amounts, large tests, I think frequency probably has something to do with it, but I can't actually present the paper that differentiates. That summative is more effective for retention of information than formative. That assessment is more effective at helping students retain their learning than restudying more lectures or even innovative teaching with peer teaching. And the use of constructed response questions, open text questions, is more effective than selected response questions, multiple choice questions. Okay, so summative assessment has a big impact on learning, and that's what I meant when I said at the very beginning, assessment drives learning. But there are real dangers with lots of summative assessment. A heavy assessment programme appears to result in student and staff stress, and of course is costly in terms of resources, effort, and quality assurance processes. So it's not a real solution, and I think we all have seen the effects of student stress in recent years. So we have to use other features of assessment and get them really right to help maximise our students' learning effect, while using the amount of summative assessment and the timing of summative assessment judiciously as well. John Biggs coined the phrase constructive alignment, which I've put a diagram of up here. And he meant by this that if our students are to achieve the outcomes we want them to achieve, we've got to make the assessment match the intended learning. And if the assessment matches the intended learning, students will adopt the learning behaviours we want them to and pay attention to what's important. That, I think everyone would agree with now. However, it's seldom so well aligned. Let's think about our final year students. It's very clear, wherever we are, what our new doctors need to be able to do. We can carry out a needs analysis, and that is the required performance we want our students to gain and informs our intended assessment. That pen picture of your new doctor should then inform how we write our intended learning outcomes. But that's more difficult than it seems. And we use those written intended learning outcomes to design our assessment. And I think you'll all already have had hints from what Ollie said earlier. It is really difficult to assess all the things we really want to assess in our students. So we've also now got to think about our students' learning behaviours. And ideally, they should be looking at the intended learning outcomes to guide all that they're going to learn and practice. But you and I know that real students ask their peers, their senior peers, what's in the real assessment? They may read the learning outcomes, but they say, what am I going to be assessed in? What's really important? And that is what really informs their learning behaviours. And thus, if we're not as careful as we can be, the achieved learning falls short of the intended learning outcomes. So this is a very important lesson to take on board if we're going to match all these complex skills, competences, professionalism to our graduates. Think very hard about the jobs that our students are going to do, the responsibilities, the professional attributes, and try to take account of those in how we assess. Now, this is the bit of revision, since Ollie has already introduced you to Miller's pyramid, which was also adapted by Norshini. And you can see this going from knows to knows how, shows how, and does. Increasingly authentic tasks at the top of that triangle. And Ollie also introduced you to the fact that we could use MCQs, essays, short answer questions, and vivas to assess knows and knows how. We quite typically use OSCEs. Do people understand that acronym? Objective Standardized Clinical Exams for assessing clinical practice. And some places also use OSLERs, which are Objective Standard long examination records. But if we really want to examine students undertaking real work, we need to look at multi-source feedback, entrustable professional activities that Ollie has talked about, mini-sexes, and direct observation of procedures. So it's useful to have in your minds these different tools and ideally what they are assessing. But I'd like to step aside and just also introduce you to the concept, or reintroduce you to the concept of validity. And validity, does this really assess what we think it assesses? Not just does it seem right, but actually does it give us a reliable result? And whereas the assessment of real practice is incredibly authentic and valid, it's quite difficult to get reliable results. There are ways of doing it, and I wish we had longer, because I'm not saying you cannot get reliable results, but you need multi-source observations and panels that make final decisions. So it's quite difficult to get reliable results. Whereas using multiple choice questions, short answer questions, you more easily get reliable results from your exams. And it's quite interesting that in the literature there's a fairly good correlation between the results of MCQs and the results of doctors in early years practice. So they seem to have good predictive validity. However, I'm not sure of the whole context of those research, that research, and it may be that they paid attention to having some of the assessment of real practice enough to steer their students. They were not just relying on MCQs and essays. Because if we do that and don't pay attention to assessing clinical work, we are very likely to get theoreticians, but not professional people who can take responsibility and act in the real workplace. So that's a bit of a conflict between reliability and validity. It'd be fantastic to discuss it further, but not for today. So if we are to help focus our students' learning on what's important, we need to tell them, don't we? And many of us will be quite familiar with the array of outcome statements that we create and learning objectives. I think it goes without saying today in medical education that we really have to be clear to our students about what we expect them to learn so that they will actually put in place effective learning and pay attention to what is most important. But the problem is that students have great difficulty understanding learning outcomes, really internalising them and understanding the scope of them, especially if we just use the verbs. If we say you've got to be able to make clinical decisions, take a history, make management decisions. And through my work in Edinburgh and that I've carried on in Aston Medical School, we explored with our students what it was they really needed to improve their understanding of learning outcomes. And what it is, they need to know, what are the lists of diseases I need to know? What are the lists of presentations? What are the lists of drugs? What are the practical procedures? So that detail that they can hang on their learning outcomes. So I've spent quite a lot of time trying to do that, and latterly the UK General Medical Council, in its preparing for our new national exams that come in next academic year, which all UK graduates will have to sit, the medical licensing assessment, they have described a core curriculum listing the presentations and the diseases, which I think is remarkably helpful for students. And as well as giving students very clear information about intended learning outcomes, healthcare programs now increasingly enhance our students' understanding of high quality work through developing their assessment literacy. And by that I mean we actually explain the whole assessment program to them. We help them to devise mark schemes and interpret mark schemes. We always give them mark schemes before we set them a task. And we help them to understand how exactly we set the pass score, because there isn't a set pass score. And we also explain academic feedback. It's not easy, and sometimes they fall asleep. But we've tried using team-based learning as a way to engage them more in that task. A more applied but complex method of increasing our students' assessment literacy is to actually engage them in assessing work, in peer assessment, whereby, and by peer assessment I mean Topping's definition here, where individuals would consider the amount, the level, the value of and the products of other students' work at the same level. So I'm not talking about senior students assessing junior students here. I'm talking about students assessing peers. And the advantage of that is that it gives them insight into what their peers are submitting, the quality of work, the varying approaches that they could use. We were drawn to peer assessment because of the importance given to it by various researchers, particularly the fact that it encourages student engagement, gives them additional formative feedback in the words of their peers, helps their self-regulation, and in particular, and this is where I think we can buy into what students are concerned about, improving their subsequent performance at exams. In Edinburgh, we did this in the master's programme in assessment. We gave our students the opportunity to assess their peers' literature searches. And it did give them the opportunity to see other people's work. What did we find? Well, I think this nice picture of an Outward Bound class really summarises it. They were really appreciative of seeing other people's work at the same level and being able to see how their work maybe was better, less good, different. And by giving every student several pieces of work to review, they had the chance of seeing some high quality work. And it's seeing it that makes you think, That's what they're after. That's what I'm aiming for. They were also very appreciative of their peers' feedback. But not everyone engaged because they didn't understand the value or they couldn't give the time to it. So if we're to do it better, and again, I think we need to pay a lot of attention to explaining to the students why we want them to do it, what they might gain from, and perhaps discuss how their assessment may differ from ours. But powerful, but complicated. So turning back to other forms of formative assessment, we noted before that learning gains are not as significant as with summative assessment, but we can learn to use formative assessment in particular ways to maximise that learning. I've only time to speak about a couple of papers by Hatala and Jeff Norman. And they looked at teaching their students to read ECGs. And they found that if they got their students to actually contrast ECGs, instead of just explain this ECG, explain the next ECG, but contrast them. And if, as the students were learning more and more complex ECGs, they brought back in the ECGs the students had looked at earlier, the students really focused on the differences, reminded themselves of the early learning, and at the end of the course were much better at assessing new ECGs. Norman similarly published a paper in 2009 summarising the literature on what we can do to help our students transfer their learning, their new learning, to completely new situations, new examples. And I'm just summarising it here to say that the formative assessment we give them, it must be very deliberate. We must get students to contrast new examples with old. So don't just ask our students about asthma if we're teaching them about asthma, and then when we move on to chronic pulmonary disease, just ask about chronic pulmonary disease, and then just ask about neoplasia. But remember to bring in scenarios that will help them get maybe confused between asthma and chronic pulmonary disease, but then rediscover the differences. And the same with every new disease. Keep going back to introduce mixed practice and space out the practice so that don't let the early learning completely deteriorate. This little diagram is here to demonstrate how over time your knowledge will decay. However, if you're encouraged to review it and revive it, it will of course decay again, but at a set time you will still have retained more. So our challenge in formative assessment is to keep mixing up the material, get students to revisit previous material, and to bring to their attention cases that could be confusing, which they really have to differentiate between. I'm going to finish by speaking about academic feedback, because it's a really important component of assessment, and particularly formative assessment. Bauer explored this diagram. It's trying to show you Dallas's theoretical model of the effectiveness of high support challenge approach to mentoring. And Bauer undertook to validate this in the context of mentoring academic physicians, who felt that the best mentors were not those who just kept saying, well done, keep going, well done, keep going, but had compliments to make, recognized the worth and the work that the trainees were putting in, but kept saying, where next? How next? How will you make it better? And these academic physicians really rated these mentors. Unfortunately, junior doctors and our students don't seem to recognize that or appreciate it. This paper by Bauer I think exemplifies the problem that many of us face, and that's why I've called it the tutor's dilemma, that students really enjoy having compliments. But in this class of a simple practical skill, although they enjoyed having compliments, their practice didn't improve. Whereas those that were more constructively criticised and told how to improve thought their feedback wasn't very good, didn't rate it, but actually when they were retested, they had improved. So I think this is the dilemma all of us face: how to improve our students' performance while keeping them on board and engaged. So I'm going to leave you with some questions. How are we going to motivate our students, give them honest, constructive feedback while continuing to motivate them? I dug out van der Ridder's paper again. It got a lot of airtime on describing academic feedback in clinical assessment. And I think that we ignore some of her components. She talks about the importance of interaction and discussion, and the importance of completing the cycle. In other words, letting the student have another go pretty soon after you give the feedback to see have they really got it. I think both these approaches could help us maintain student self-esteem and improve their practice. And to return to my peer presenter, Ollie, who took the self-determination theory by Deci and Ryan, who have explored self-motivation for years and years and come up with the importance of belonging, autonomy, and competence as three components of self-motivation. But as Ollie says, as soon as you start assessing people, maybe it's because of the way we give feedback, it seems to undermine their sense of competence and thus their self-determination and motivation. What can we do about this to be honest with our students, to develop their performance, but without undermining their self-esteem? I'm going to leave you with these three take-home messages, just a summary of things to think about when we're thinking about how can summative assessment help improve learning, how can formative assessment help improve learning, and what about academic feedback? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Helen. That was very, very stimulating and just underlining how complex it is to assess our student and how we can, there's many aspects we may improve or study in order to make better exam and better assessment. Now we come back to Italy, and we have the talk by Professor Giuseppe Famigliari, and so you can relax a little bit because it's going to be in Italian. Giuseppe Famigliari is a full professor of human anatomy at La Sapienza University. He's president of medicine and surgery course and coordinator of education of the healthcare area at medical and psychology faculty. Coordinator of the institutional project Online Orientation, Vice President of National Board of Presidents of Italian Medical School, ANVUR expert and evaluator, and he has interest on medical education since many years. He is a senior member of the Società Italiana di Pedagogia Medica, and in particular, he has a very complicated task at La Sapienza. He is the guardian, the guarantor, I didn't find a better way to say it, degli studenti della Sapienza. Il garante. So all the students at La Sapienza, if they have something to say or to discuss, they go to see Professor Famigliari. So, poverino, I must say. Prego.
Grazie davvero per l'invito a questo importante simposio, and thank you for Professor Tenkate and Professor Cameron for the superlative relation speaking we have. Io parlerò in italiano perché sarebbe troppo complesso spiegare in breve le cose che voglio dire, però le diapositive slides was in English and I speak in Italian what is present on the slide. Una breve presentazione della SIPEM, la Società Italiana di Pedagogia Medica, viene creata nel 1985. Nel primo periodo c'era stato un gruppo di pedagogia genovese che aveva creato una istituzione che collaborava con l'Europa e aveva tradotto in italiano un testo famosissimo, il Gilbert, che era il testo di allora guida della medical education internazionale. Dopo questo primo periodo abbiamo le attività della SmithKline Foundation, cioè della Fondazione SmithKline, che organizzava in Italia negli anni dall'80 fino al 90 dei seminari, e dove veramente anch'io mi appassionai alla didattica proprio partecipando a questi seminari della SmithKline. Io prima la mia vita era dentro il laboratorio di microscopia elettronica, poi mi appassionai anche di didattica e mi ricordo che il mio capo, che era il presidente della Società Mondiale dell'Anatomia dell'epoca, mi disse: ma fai attenzione, perché se poi ti metti a fare molta didattica pubblicherai di meno. Aveva giustamente ragione, però diciamo che le soddisfazioni a lavorare insieme con gli studenti non sono mancate. L'ultimo periodo corrisponde alla fondazione della Società Italiana di Pedagogia Medica. La Società Italiana di Pedagogia Medica organizza congressi, il prossimo è questo mese a Torino, per esempio, promuove azioni di pedagogia medica a livello sia nazionale che a livello internazionale. Vi sono dei gruppi di coordinamento regionali. Io a lungo tempo ho coordinato il gruppo della Regione Lazio di questa società. Organizza programmi di faculty development. Faculty development è un termine non tanto nuovo ma importante, perché significa far migliorare nei membri della facoltà la competenza per l'insegnamento, la consapevolezza del loro lavoro, che deve comprendere anche in maniera piena l'insegnamento, il contatto con gli studenti, il giusto rapporto con gli studenti. E la SIPEM è molto impegnata in questo. La SIPEM ha una rivista scientifica che si chiama Tutor, è online e sono benvenuti tutti i vostri articoli scientifici su innovazione didattica. Questa è la locandina del prossimo congresso che si terrà il 26-28 ottobre a Torino, e queste sono due immagini che fanno vedere l'ultimo congresso di Napoli, dove erano presenti anche Fred Hefferty e Arno Kumagai. Yes. Da cui abbiamo imparato molto in quella occasione. C'è, a dire il vero, anche la conferenza permanente dei presidenti dei corsi di medicina. La vostra presidente del corso è una delle assidue partecipanti ai lavori, e questa conferenza, che nasce nell'85, ormai ha 38 anni di attività, e anche la nostra conferenza, quella di cui io in questo momento mi onoro di fare il vicepresidente, ha un sito dove è reperibile la rivista, il Journal of Italian Medical Education, che c'è tutto l'archivio in libera consultazione, e anche la conferenza ha organizzato le proprie attività nel senso dell'innovazione pedagogica, nel senso di far migliorare ai docenti la comprensione di tutti i temi che riguarda il rapporto con gli studenti e l'insegnamento, organizzando gruppi di lavoro, organizzando meeting periodici, generalmente ne vengono fatti 4 l'anno, 2 a Roma e altri 2 ospitati da tutte le sedi italiane. Unica Millus può essere anche una sede che potrebbe decidere di ospitare un convegno, magari quello di 2 giorni, che è quello più importante. Naturalmente c'è una grande sinergia con le altre istituzioni come i ministeri dell'università, della ricerca, della salute, l'ordine dei medici. Noi abbiamo attivato da almeno 4 anni un tavolo tecnico permanente con il direttivo della FOMCEO, e per esempio in quell'ambito abbiamo messo a punto tutto l'iter della laurea abilitante, che adesso è diventata norma attiva. E naturalmente interagiamo continuamente anche con le associazioni degli studenti. Anche da noi si parla di faculty development e si parla anche in questi ultimi tempi di professionalità e di identità professionale come argomenti importanti nella formazione dei nostri studenti. Si parla anche di formazione, per esempio nel fascicolo 88, che è l'ultimo che è stato messo online pochi giorni fa, c'è un bellissimo articolo scritto da Alfred Tenore che è dedicato all'allineamento costruttivo. Lì troverete molte delle cose che hanno detto i nostri 2 speaker importanti di oggi. E perché quello pure è un argomento importante, cioè se io voglio che quando io faccio un tipo di formazione poi devo mettere a punto un tipo di esame che sia allineato con la formazione che ho fatto, altrimenti tutto il processo crolla. Quindi attualmente la conferenza è dedicata a queste linee pedagogiche per promuovere l'eccellenza nella educazione medica sul territorio italiano. E questa è la copertina, vedete, dell'ultimo numero, ma basta andare su internet e mettere Presidenti Medicina, che fortunatamente compare come primo indirizzo il sito della conferenza e tutti gli articoli di questa rivista. Un breve flash sul curriculum di medicina che abbiamo oggi in Italia. Abbiamo fatto nell'ultima indagine sul professionalism che abbiamo fatto quest'anno, viene fuori che circa il 60% dei corsi di medicina italiani hanno questo profilo biomedico psicosociale. Che cosa significa? Esistono nel mondo 2 grossi profili formativi, uno biomedico e uno psicosociale, uno dedicato esclusivamente alla scienza e alle evidenze scientifiche, l'altro invece è dedicato più al racconto del paziente, al rapporto con il paziente e così via. Noi nel 1999 mettemmo insieme questi 2 profili e in Italia fondammo questo profilo biomedico psicosociale. Salto queste che ci illustrano. Questo era un articolo del 2001 in cui illustrava quelli che erano i programmi pedagogici e l'impostazione di questi corsi. Li salto per brevità. Faccio vedere questo grafico che in pratica fa vedere quello che il professor Tenkate ha fatto vedere prima. Lo pubblicammo su Medical Teacher nel 2009 e illustrava lo shift del passaggio in Italia negli anni 2000 da un tipo di didattica tradizionale, questa che è qui alla vostra sinistra, ad un tipo di didattica integrata, verticale, dove c'erano due grandi rows verticali. Uno, quello biomedico, che è organizzato a Z. In parallelo un'altra striscia verticale di argomenti che vengono insegnati tuttora in tutti gli anni, dal primo fino al sesto, di argomenti psicosociali. E vedete la bioetica, l'epidemiologia, la metodologia, la comunicazione, la storia, l'epistemologia e così via. E allora, mettendo insieme questi due grossi argomenti, in realtà in tutti i corsi italiani oggi portiamo gli studenti già dal primo anno al letto del paziente. Per esempio al Sant'Andrea gli studenti del primo anno fanno quella che si chiama anamnesi psicosociale. Gli studenti del primo anno passano una settimana in reparto. C'è qualche collega che era del Sant'Andrea come me, può testimoniare che dico il vero, no, perché è importante. E allora gli viene insegnata l'anamnesi psicosociale. Ovviamente loro al primo anno non sanno nulla di medicina clinica, però imparano a dare la mano al paziente, imparano a chiedere la storia del paziente, imparano a socializzare con il paziente, e questo in realtà gli dà un imprinting molto più forte. Recentemente, dal 2019, in Italia nasce un nuovo tipo di corso di laurea. Lo sviluppo tecnologico, che ormai è imperversa, ha fatto sì che in Italia nascessero per primi a Milano Humanitas e Politecnico, a Roma le facoltà di medicina con le facoltà di ingegneria insieme. Viene organizzato un corso di medicina e chirurgia high technology, dove c'è un grande apporto di materie ingegneristiche insegnate da docenti dei corsi di ingegneria. E ne avevamo dato notizia anche qui in questo articolo su Medical Teacher, che è molto più recente, dove appunto viene fatto vedere come in Italia ci sia sempre un arrangiamento dei corsi verticali con l'integrazione. Tra gli autori c'è Dario Torre. Dario Torre is Jungo. Ok, Dario Torre è un americano, ma è un romano di Roma, perché però è da 40 anni, 30 anni che sta in America, ed è naturalmente molto famoso nell'ambito della pedagogia medica. E quindi c'è l'aspetto psicosociale e l'aspetto tecnologico integrato. L'integrazione è un concetto importante, come ci hanno fatto vedere loro. Quindi anche in questo tipo di organizzazione noi abbiamo delle riunioni continue. Per esempio, tra qualche giorno dovremo rivedere un corso di tecnologia tecnomedica che è fatto dall'internista, da un ingegnere, il cui ingegnere dice: ma io che c'entro? Però gli dobbiamo far capire che lui c'entra, ma si deve integrare con le discipline mediche, e non può fare un corso su cose troppo particolari, perché quello poi è il problema dell'integrazione, il dialogo continuo. Questi sono gli argomenti che noi abbiamo introdotto all'interno del corso di laurea in medicina e alta tecnologia. Ce ne sono 7 in Italia attivati in questo momento. La tecnologia digitale è un argomento importante, ne stanno discutendo anche in FOMCEO. La conclusione, per esempio, sull'intelligenza artificiale è che questa sì è un mezzo importante, è un mezzo che va utilizzato, ma va dominato, e sempre dalla persona, dal medico che la utilizza, che deve avere anche una competenza per utilizzarla. Questi studenti di questi corsi, per esempio, loro iniziano a imparare la programmazione con Python, che ci hanno detto gli ingegneri che è importante per l'intelligenza artificiale, e poi questo lo fanno dal terzo anno. Gli studenti di medicina di High Technology studiano anche la matematica e l'algebra, studiano la fisica in maniera molto più potente rispetto agli studenti che non hanno questo indirizzo, e naturalmente da lì parte poi l'impostazione che li porterà a fare i corsi di intelligenza artificiale con la medicina interna, dove ci sono più corsi dal quarto anno in poi che mettono sempre insieme clinici, chirurghi, clinici, medici, chirurghi, ingegneri, e trattano di questi argomenti insieme in maniera tale che questi laureati del futuro, in Italia ancora non abbiamo laureati di questo tipo, sappiano maneggiare con più consapevolezza la cura, sapendola dominare. Allora, sto perdendo tempo, sarò rapidissimo. Fare didattica di alta qualità richiede la presenza di docenti motivati. C'è questo libro molto, molto bello scritto da Arden che vedete qui nella fotografia al centro, che si intitola Gli 8 ruoli del docente medico. E vedete in questo elenco sono comprese tutte le attività che noi facciamo, il role model, essere ricercatore, essere un buon esaminatore, essere un buon sviluppatore di curriculum, essere un mentor, essere un facilitatore, essere un allenatore dei propri studenti. Il concetto è molto semplice. Un allenatore di una squadra di calcio che ha 30 giocatori, lui per il lavoro che fa porta all'eccellenza tutti e 30 i giocatori, o almeno ci prova, perché anche se poi la partita della domenica è fatta da 11 giocatori, ma lui sa che all'eccellenza non può portare solo 11, li deve portare tutti. E allora questo è l'impegno importante. Nelle nostre classi di studenti chi sta più indietro deve essere portato per mano avanti con il tutorato, con tutte quelle azioni che i due illustri colleghi ci hanno fatto vedere. Questo elenco che vedete qui fu un discorso di Ronald Arden alla MIE dell'anno scorso, combattere le ortodossie dell'insegnamento, cioè è un elenco di argomenti, metodi riflessivi, le competenze emozionali, la diversità degli studenti e l'inclusione. Ogni studente è diverso l'uno dall'altro perché c'è chi impara subito, chi impara con più lentezza. Sono tutti e due studenti eccezionali. Uno ci mette 10 giorni, l'altro ci mette 20 giorni, ma sono studenti da considerare diversamente per farli andare avanti tutti insieme, altrimenti quello che ci mette 20 giorni rimane escluso dalla corsa che fa quel gruppo di studenti che sono più veloci. E esiste una grande letteratura su questo, sulla slow medicine, che appunto mette in evidenza come non tutti noi abbiamo le stesse velocità nell'apprendere e nel mettere, e ce l'ha fatto vedere il professor Tenkate prima, facendoci vedere quel grafico dove per avere la padronanza di una tecnica che c'è chi richiede 100 volte e chi richiede 500 volte. Il concetto è quello. Questa è una diapositiva fatta vedere dalla nuova presidente della MI, e che vedete questo cerchio qui dice che il docente deve essere professionale per insegnare la cosa giusta, il docente deve fare le cose pratiche bene per insegnare la cosa corretta, e naturalmente l'educatore, il docente, deve essere abile ad insegnare the right person, quello che una persona corretta deve fare. Per insegnare come si diventa right person? Bisogna essere right person, assolutamente. La inclusione, questo anche era uno dei motivi dell'ultimo congresso, tante conferenze dedicate all'inclusione e dedicate anche, questa era la lettura finale che c'è stata, molto bella, dedicate alla inclusività negli esami, nella pratica degli esami, da tenere molto importanti. Allora, come sono i nostri studenti? Sono le ultime diapositive. Noi abbiamo fatto come conferenza uno studio longitudinale che non è ancora concluso, che ha interessato 8 sedi universitarie: Caltanissetta, Chieti, Foggia, Milano, Palermo, Pavia, Roma e Torino, dando a circa 800 studenti una serie di questionari che qui vedete, le scale di autoefficacia, il BFQ, l'IRI, l'SCL 90, le scale di positività e così via. E questo stessi questionari li abbiamo dati agli stessi studenti in entrata al terzo anno e al termine del loro percorso formativo. Stiamo aspettando per vedere dove si sono, non ho i risultati del sesto anno, ma dovremmo averli a breve. Che cosa succede? Che gli studenti che entrano, questi erano circa 1000 studenti, 800, quasi 900. I nostri studenti che entrano nei corsi di medicina dal nord, dal centro e al sud hanno sicuramente una grande capacità di autoregolazione, hanno un alto livello di empatia. In tutti gli aspetti che questa comporta, così come ad avere la prospettiva verso gli altri, ad essere abili a mantenere un comportamento corretto e così via. Quindi sono studenti che hanno tutte le qualità positive. E questo lo dimostrano questo studio che abbiamo pubblicato in questa fase sulla rivista nel 2017. Quello che viene dopo, nel questionario del terzo anno, di cui abbiamo i risultati preliminari, diciamo che questi stessi studenti presentano una lieve diminuzione della self-efficacy e della soddisfazione personale, lieve, cioè diminuisce ma non significativamente, aumenta quasi in maniera significativa il livello di ansia, il livello di stress. Sono al terzo anno. Ho messo questo lavoro importantissimo a cui ne sono seguiti tanti anni, è del 2009, The Devil is in the third year. Che significa? Significa che negli studenti nel mondo entrano empatici e escono cinici, ed è una evidenza internazionale. Esistono già tanti e tanti articoli che stanno vedendo come fare per evitare questo, perché ovviamente se uno studente entra nel corso empatico e super positivo e esce un po' agitato e cinico, la colpa di chi è? È dell'ambiente formativo che noi costruiamo. È un'evidenza, penso, fuori discussione. Cito questa battuta che ha girato su internet di Giorgio Napolitano, il nostro presidente emerito della Repubblica, e che è pertinente e dice: non si può correre il rischio che i giovani si scoraggino, non possiamo rischiare che non vedano la possibilità di realizzarsi, avere un'occupazione e una vita degna nel nostro paese. Ci sono nelle nuove generazioni riserve magnifiche di energia, di talento e di volontà. Ecco, questo è un messaggio che serve a dire: attenzione, noi abbiamo un dovere importante, quello di non farci sfuggire i nostri studenti dalle mani e di saperli condurre in porto velocemente, facendogli apprendere le cose e senza creare in loro né ansia e né stress e né calo dell'autostima, come anche questa ricerca italiana comincia a dimostrare in parallelo a quello che si sa della letteratura internazionale. Grazie.
Grazie Giuseppe per aver tradotto in maniera più diretta tanti concetti che sono stati espressi dai nostri ospiti illustrissimi, ma è stato molto utile, mi sembra proprio un bel riassunto di tantissimi aspetti e tantissimi punti su cui lavorare. Chiudiamo in bellezza con Amanda Murphy, la mia ex collega della Cattolica, la quale ci parlerà di ulteriori complication, which is first teaching in English, and since English is not our mother language, that makes everything more and more difficult. And second, the multi-ethnic classes, which is a real problem that we face every day, being this an international medical school, and because we have an amount of international students that is going to grow. So we face really differences within the same group. Please, Amanda.
Thank you. Good afternoon to all of you, and I'd like to thank Federica very much for this invitation. It's been a real privilege for me to hear all the guests today. I'm not normally in a medical context. As Federica said, I work at Università Cattolica in Milan and Brescia. The Cattolica also has a campus here in Rome, where I have been to hold some workshops with the medical, should we say, the medical staff there, both the professors and the clinicians. So I just wanted to start by asking a question. Apart from me and my two colleagues here, how many people in the room do not have Italian citizenship? Okay, so that's about 5 of us. Okay, and how many people here are not teaching in English? Okay, so that's about 2 or 3 or 5, 6. Okay, so most of you are Italian, teaching in a language that is not your language of habitual use. Now, at the beginning of the afternoon, somebody said, we're in an international university and therefore we're speaking in English. Okay, I would like to raise a few questions during this short talk. Okay, I don't want to take a lot of time because you've heard a lot, but I do want to just raise a few issues that I think are worth talking about. The first thing is the Cattolica 10 years ago set up a center which wanted to concentrate on this process of internationalization. Okay, internationalization, what does that mean? All right, this is a university which has a lot of degree courses in English. All right, why does it have degree courses in English? Okay, well, we all know that the student population in Italy is falling, and therefore we can attract students from abroad. And secondly, we have a lot of Italians who understand the importance of English as an international language and think, aha, if I study through English, I will be ready for the international market. Okay? Now, some of that is true, okay? It is a fact that if you can function well in English, you are able to travel and work elsewhere. But it's not all that easy, all right? So, as I was saying, the Cattolica set up a center 10 years ago. Am I standing too close to the microphone? It seems to be objecting to my plosives and fricatives. The Cattolica set up a center precisely to study this process of internationalization, to do research and to do training in this area. And CAE, as we call it, it's an Italian acronym, even though the title of the center is English, Center for Higher Education Internationalization. All right, is now a big community with lots of academics and students from all around the world. Okay, so we have international faculty and board, etc. We do a doctoral program in internationalization of higher education, and we do training for English medium education. And that is why I've been invited here today, because I can raise a few questions with you about what is difficult, what is challenging for you, as well as for the students, okay? So I'm going to skip through these just because I wasn't quite sure how much time I would have. Okay, so some of the questions regard the fact that we have assumptions about what we're doing, okay? Teaching my courses in English does not differ from teaching them in Italian. Now, some of you may be doing courses both in English and in Italian, all right? I'm not going to do a survey now, but do you think they should be the same? All right, do you think that it's enough to switch the language? Okay, if not, why not? All right, the diversity among students in international classes creates opportunities. Now, how much do you agree with that? Okay, I'd like to just say something which comes out of research, and that is that by putting international students together, it does not mean that you create intercultural competence. Okay, it does not happen by osmosis. Okay, if you're sitting next to somebody who doesn't share your language and your culture, you don't automatically become an interculturally competent person. All right, and the third assumption that I'm challenging is international study programs are taught through English. Just because you're doing it in English doesn't necessarily mean that it's international. It gives you opportunities, but you could be doing it in Spanish. You could be doing it in Chinese. You could be doing it in Arabic. And you can still have an international classroom. Okay, now, some of the things that we don't think about, all right, are the things that we would like to discuss when we do a training course, okay? And the first thing is the idea of culture. Okay, teaching and learning cultures. Now, I grew up in the UK. I went to university in the UK. I then came to Italy and went to university again and graduated in a laurea quadriennale. And then I went back to the UK to do a PhD. And then I've had my career in Italy for the last 32 years. So I have been between these two cultures for a long time. Okay, but so that gives me a certain understanding of what an Italian lecturer expects from a class, okay? If you've had an experience in the UK where, because of immigration, because of a lot more social mobility, the academic staff is much more international, okay? What is expected of you is very, very different, okay? Now, I don't know if you're aware, but in Italy, there is 1% of non-Italian academics in the Italian academic system. Okay, 1%. I'm one of that 1% because I still don't have an Italian passport, although I'm trying to get one, thanks to Brexit. But the point here I'm trying to make is that you do need to move across academic cultures to understand what it means to, what the lecturer is expecting from you. When we talk about culture, we can talk about ethnicity, okay? What do you eat when you go home? What language do you talk with your parents? What language do you use on social media, okay? What is academic culture, all right? Now, in an international classroom, okay, the culture needs to be negotiated, all right? Because the teacher is going to come from a culture and needs to be able to be flexible with the international classroom in front of them. Now, how many of you, if you're teaching an international classroom and you might have 10 different nationalities, how many of you understand after the exams that the students do not know what you're looking for? All right, developing that kind of dialogue about what the academic culture is something we need to concentrate on, because the two elephants in the room, if you like, are language and culture. All right, the fact that nobody so far has really talked about English as the medium of instruction, except Federica at the beginning. But we do need to wonder, why are we using English and how are we using English? And if I'm a mother tongue English person and I've got a Pakistani in front of me who speaks English perfectly well, we don't necessarily understand each other. Right? So the way we develop the culture of the classroom needs to be done through a negotiation. All right? You can't just go in there and think that because you're using a language the other people use, that everything is automatically clear. Local culture. One of the big issues of international classrooms is the fact that many people come to an English taught program and never learn the language of the nation. How many of your students cannot go into an Italian bar and quite naturally interact with the barman, okay? They are isolated, okay? So all these, shall we say, facets of what culture means are things that need to feed into the development of the course, the development of the learning outcomes, as we heard before, the development of the assessment process. All of this is kind of taken for granted. This is just another, shall we say, adaptation of the same kinds of ideas, but there are lots of things that need to be discussed when you are preparing your courses and preparing your assessments, okay? The ethnic culture, the local culture, the disciplinary culture, all right? Now, it's been really interesting for me to hear my colleagues talking about the development of medical education, all right? Because it seems to be maybe a lot more advanced than the, should we say, the education in other fields, all right? If 2 history professors had been here, would they have been so stimulating in the way they talk about the development of their curriculum, etc.? So how you teach, all right, what you expect your students to give you back, where your concepts come from. I mean, for example, doing things through English, all right, goes under the umbrella of internationalization at home, all right? Most people think of internationalization as mobility, all right? I've been on an Erasmus mobility to Oxford, therefore I've got some teaching experience abroad, okay? Well, maybe, 8 hours of teaching in another country tells you something, but how much have you really understood about that? Internationalization is not just mobility. Mobility is an important part. But internationalization means developing a curriculum which also refers to other cultures apart from the dominant one, all right? There's this movement of decolonialization of the curriculum, particularly in the global south, right? Everybody thinks that Western-generated ideas are the way to go. Well, not necessarily, all right? A lot of the world is actually not in the West. So internationalization at home means changing what you're doing in a context which is truly international, not just because you're talking English, all right? And it also means developing references to other types of literatures. I want to just focus for a minute on the student's point of view, all right? Because the classroom is made up of the teachers and the students, okay? In my centre, there is a postdoctoral fellow, Olivia Mayer, an Australian who has been in Italy for a number of years as well. And she is investigating student expectations, all right, of teaching and learning in an international study program. Okay, so why do Italians enroll in an English taught program in Italy? Most of them think they're going to get better English. Research tells you that, in fact, they're not necessarily any better at English at the end of their degree course, okay? Why do international students come to Italy to study through English? They don't want to improve their English, all right? They're interested in getting a good degree from a good university and being able to spend it elsewhere, okay? So the expectations of your Italian students and your non-Italian students are going to be radically different, okay? So this research, for example, says that the perception of internationalization differs considerably between the Italians, should we say, or the local students, in this case, they're Italian, and the non-Italians, all right? Let's take it for granted that you're a new and innovative university, okay? But the Italian academic culture is teacher-centered and lecture-focused, all right? Our Dutch friend here may be shocked to hear that, but that's the reality, okay? So these research questions say, okay, what are the expectations of teaching and learning in these 2 groups of students, domestic and international, okay? And what are the factors that affect student expectations about studying in an international program? Okay, so the international students have much greater expectations for how you deal with teaching and learning. They want really varied teaching practices. They want really varied teaching assessments. The Italians who've been through Italian schools don't expect that. They find it really difficult to deal with that. Yeah? Okay. The Italians, as I said before, have expectations about improving their English. All right? Well, that's not necessarily the case. So, what do students have? Students have high expectations, okay, of encountering the features of an internationalized study program, all right? They want to be in a diverse cohort of students, all right? Now, what does that mean for you if you're designing the course? That means you have to play on that diversity, all right? The students are looking for an experience of an international classroom. How can you create that? What are the sorts of things that you need to do for that to be a resource, an opportunity, and not just a challenge for you? Okay, they want to interact with students and teachers with different backgrounds. Okay, so how can you create opportunities for that interaction to happen? They're looking for developing intercultural competence. Okay, now we always think we are interculturally competent because we've traveled, okay? But that doesn't mean that we're internationally competent, okay? To really understand how you can get your Chinese students to come out of their shell, for me, it's a real problem. I've got Chinese students, and another thing, for example, I have a large number of people who I think are Chinese students, and they've actually never been to China. They are the children of Chinese immigrants who speak Italian better than I do. They just look totally Chinese because they have Chinese parents. That is a new category of student that we need to learn about, we need to listen to, we need to take them into consideration when we are designing our courses and our assessments, because they're actually embarrassed to talk to Chinese students. I've got a student who really wanted to graduate on time because she said to me, she looked Chinese, but she'd grown up in China. And she said, I'm really looking forward to my work placement in Beijing, because I've never been to Beijing. For me, that was an absolute eye-opener, because we all have assumptions, okay? And the basic problem is that we don't interact with our students. The international classroom needs to be an opportunity. It was very interesting to hear what they said at the end, belonging. All right, students want to belong. How do you get to understand if people belong or not? Well, you need to create community. You need to get to know them, all right? And that is one of the great pluses of the international classroom, where in a sense, you know, nobody belongs. We need to create that sense of belonging, yeah? Okay. I want to talk just for a minute about the lecturer's point of view. Now, in our courses, all right, we generally do 4 workshops, okay? And it's a very interesting experience. I'm here with my colleague Jane, who is one of the educational developers in the centre. I asked her to come along because I thought it would be good to, you know, experience this afternoon with you in this new university. But what we find is that these training courses that we do, first of all, break down barriers between disciplines. All right, in Cattolica, we have 12 faculties, right? Not in every campus, but we have people from, you know, the arts, the sciences and everything. You never talk to them. And yet there are people teaching through English with international students who've got exactly the same problem as you have. How do you draw out the Koreans? If you've got a group of South Asian students, do they talk to each other? What kind of political relations are there between their cultures? You know, as it's a real challenge for the lecturer if the class is truly diverse in terms of language and culture. So you can have a complete, you know, renewal of your approach to the classroom if you begin to use these students as a resource. But it's a lonely experience, okay? Now, in your case, it would be interesting to talk to you one-to-one, but in our case, you know, you have an English taught program, the history is done through English, the politics is done through English. They're teachers of different subjects. I mean, you have different subjects, but you're all in medicine, okay? Do you actually talk to each other? If you have a bad evaluation, either of your English or of your style of explanation of the exams, do you tell anybody? You know, does anybody see except the dean and you? What do you do with that feedback? You know, there is a real loneliness in the experience of the lecturer in front of a difficult situation, and they don't know how to deal with it. So what we find is that these small groups, these training courses that we do, are an opportunity to break down disciplinary barriers and also hierarchical barriers. Okay, so I don't know what the culture is here. You know, often in an English-speaking environment, there's no tu and lei, all right? You just on first-name terms. I don't know your reality. But in an Italian university, you're very careful. Are you talking to the dean? Are you talking to a secretary? Are you talking to an ordinario? Are you talking to an assegnista? This kind of cultural differences that the international students have no idea about. You know, it's ciao ciao and we're all good friends. But, you know, that's the kind of thing that if in these small training courses that we do, we can actually break down those barriers and concentrate on the issues that come out. Okay, there are other issues. Let's say you have a student who's actually very talented, but their English is really bad. They're from Turkey or whatever, they can get by. Does it matter when you assess them? Does it matter what their English is like? Is their English bad, so bad that it's actually preventing them from being effective in what they're supposed to do? And there's also the question of, you know, not only English, but, for example, the question of empathy, communicative style. All right, you're training doctors. Now, I don't know, you've got a Korean, he graduates here. Where can he practice? Where can he use his degree? How is he going to develop that empathy that is necessary in a patient-student relationship in a different language? You know, these are issues which are really, really interesting. Engaging students, okay? How do you draw out the students? You've got the naturally communicative ones that, you know, the Americans won't have a problem talking, okay? But as I say, that the Asian cultures tend to have, the Indians may not have a problem either. And the assessment, okay? Assessment is always an issue. I mean, today it was very interesting hearing about the development of the learning outcomes, the intended learning outcomes, aligning them to, you know, the assessment processes. Those are all things that you can work out together if you get into a group and you talk about it. Because one of the big solutions is community, not just for the students, but community for the lecturers, okay? Being able to share your issues with somebody and try and find solutions. Okay, now, I think I'm going to stop here because there's a lot I could say, but I believe we're way over time, okay? We've done quite a bit of research in this field. There's a book called Steps Towards Internationalization at Home, which I did with Vita Pensiero just this year. We've just come out with a big volume, which is open access and available through Educat, which is all research in the field of internationalization of higher education. It's a fascinating area, and I really wish you the best of luck. But I encourage you to ask yourselves these questions, all right? We need to create that culture of dialogue, all right, among the staff. That's all I want to say. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Amanda. I think somehow you summarized, you know, through the intercultural, some important issues that were discussed today. So we are running a little bit late, but I think it's important if we have some question to address to our speakers, please.
Thank you, Professor Wolf. This was a distinguished podium, and I really got a lot of take-home messages for my course. I'm a vascular surgeon, and I teach vascular surgery here. I really enjoyed the talk by Professor Tenkate. Is the correct pronunciation? Great, thanks. Tenkate, and the concept that I liked most was the concept of we have to form responsible colleagues. Being a surgeon, one of the problems we have in this country, but I guess is a problem also abroad, is that colleagues must take responsibility in the work they have to do. Otherwise, they do not operate because they're afraid, for instance, in surgery. So the concept of responsibility is very important. As Professor Cameron said, another important concept keeps students on course, and that this concept of keeping students on course, you know, I found it a little bit in contrast in some way to what you said. I appreciated everything you said. This is probably everything was exceptional. That your talk was exceptional. The only thing I didn't catch well, is it true, or maybe I was wrong in understanding, that you believe most in webinars teaching instead of frontal teaching? Because I think the empathy we can give in frontal lessons is much more of greater value than webinar. But please give me a comment about that. Thanks.
Yeah, I'll be happy to comment on that. And I completely agree with you that one of the most important things in education is interaction with other people. That is so crucial, and we know that from a lot of research and theory. So you cannot develop well if you don't interact with other people. So, and you can say, when you watch a webinar, that's no interaction. I completely agree with you with that. That holds the same for reading a textbook. Reading a textbook is not interaction either, but it's information gathering. And information can be gathered in different ways. It can be reading a textbook or listening to a webinar or just that. And a webinar has the advantage that there is more imaging and more things that could make it not interactive, but it could make it more visible that what you have to. But there has to be interaction also with teachers. And if you have a lecture hall, like we in our schools, we have enrollment of 300 students per year. In the big lecture halls, when they're all present, there might be a few students who can ask a question. And specifically, if you have a lecture of 45 minutes, there's not much interaction going on. And then still you could say there is something of the personality of the one who talks in the way they can motivate somebody else. But if you take all the lectures together and you would ask students also, which are the lectures that really struck you, then it would probably be a very small minority. And the word lecture is even kind of a weird word, so because it means reading. A lecture is like, you're an Italian, you should know that. So what many lecturers, and I remember that from my school time, people would just read what they wrote. It may have been useful 300 years ago before print was there, or so at the Bologna time of the picture was probably useful to write something, then read it loud and then hope that others will remember that or write it down and make their own notes. That's what we did when I was in medical school. But now I would say that is just a very inefficient type of education. But what you should not lose is the personal interaction. So if there's, and you can do that in very different ways. So if you ask me a question and I can answer you, even if other people listen to me, that is something different than I would just give a talk and read out loud what I have written out. So lectures may be not just one definition, but I would say that in many schools, and I do understand, we've had some preparatory talks before before the seminar this afternoon, that I understand that, so there's a lot of lectures that are actually kind of mandated also. There must be so many lectures in school, but otherwise it's not considered to be a good program. I think that thinking has shifted in many countries. So I can tell you, my school and most medical schools in the Netherlands will still have some lectures. There could be a few in the week, but there's not a single school that would have like the whole day of lectures in the morning and the afternoon. Doesn't happen anymore. Doesn't exist. And the schools that I know of in the United States and North America, I can't remember that was any school who has a program filled with lectures anymore. It just doesn't happen. Yeah, go ahead.
It really is a very interesting point to raise in discussion, but I think one important thing to say is medical schools in the UK still believe in the importance of lectures, but the busy people that give lectures and the good lecturers are in such high demand, we're trying instead to use them in interactive teaching and learning. So like the team-based learning that that Ollie. So it's not that they don't see these experts and don't hear them, but they actually hear them when the students are trying to solve real life problems, as opposed to just listen to the lecturer. So if, for example, in Aston Medical School, we have lectures, but they're not compulsory. We strongly advise that if they don't attend the lecture, they listen to them online, because every lecture is recorded. And that's very useful for students revisiting the material and revising. And it's really very, very useful in the clinical years, because students can then choose when to listen to the lectures and maybe listen to the rheumatology just before they go to rheumatology, that sort of thing. But we then require our students to attend their interactive sessions, which they have every day of the week, when they apply the knowledge that they've learned in the lecture. They can ask the lecturer for help, and the lecturer will take them from very simple problems applying that material to more complex clinically related problems. So I think we're all agreed with you, interactivity with inspiring experts, crucially important. And I think that's what I was trying to get across when I talked about the problem with academic feedback. Our students are not seeing the same people who really know them and are empathic to them and build them up, but also critique them. So those relationships are incredibly important, but increasingly we think they come across better in small group interactive learning rather than the sage on the stage, as it has been said, where the interaction is very limited. I hope that helps understand.
Any other question? Please.
I'm a thoracic surgeon, so I run here the course of general surgery. I was impressed because of the lectures. I have a question regarding the CRQ, the constructed related question, compared to the selected related question. So the recent survey highlighted that CRQ are much better than selected related questions. So I would like to hear an opinion from the faculty regarding this issue.
CRQ versus SRQ.
Constructed related questions.
So
Yeah.
the constructed response questions versus selected response questions.
That's right.
So the short answer questions versus the multiple choice questions, true-false questions. Everyone understands the language. And did you say you had experience that one was better than the other?
In the past, I worked in UK. I was consultant in Leicester, and I was a lecturer at the University of Leicester. So I had some experience. In my opinion, this is the right solution. So
Yes, and very interesting that you were working in Leicester, because Aston Medical School initially took its curriculum from Leicester, so I know quite a bit about Leicester Medical School's work. And yes, they always have some of those short answer questions in their exams. And much like the paper that was published this month in Medical Teacher, students and staff found them very helpful with respect to focusing their learning and the learning they got out of that work, and the fact that they were able to recall that learning some months down the line would suggest that the mode of the assessment had a big educational impact. The problem with constructed response questions is that they have got to be written very, very clearly. I've been an external examiner at several universities in the UK where they've used constructed response questions and discovered that if you don't write them very clearly, the students may misinterpret what's being asked and go down the wrong route. I remember in my own undergraduate education, the way you would answer what is the cause of whatever, your answer would depend whether you're sitting in the anatomy exam, the physiology exam, or the biochemistry exam. and actually knowing the discipline influenced, or it might have been a social sciences exam. So I think sometimes the language we use to ask these open-ended questions is confusing. It's different if you're asking clinical questions, which we understand the jargon better, but sometimes these causes or what's the next 3 things you'll do is not as clear to the students as they might be, and they lose a lot of marks. And that, interestingly, was the problem that the American students and staff highlighted in this recent paper. And because of that, they are not as reliable, repeatable, as MCQs and short answer questions. The other difficulty is that they don't cover quite so much of the curriculum. They take longer to write for the student, and that's a third problem, is the time it takes to mark, and the fact that you need second marking to get them really reliably marked. So that's why I was trying to hint when I was speaking that they're very useful for learning, but they do have problems about repetition and validity, as in really giving you an accurate answer of the assessment that you're trying to find. We could speak further if you want, but I hope that gives you some. I don't know whether Ollie would want to say anything.
Yeah, just to add that the experience that we had with specifically for clinical reasoning, the short answer questions actually were very favorable in our experience too. And just to make a suggestion for the coming future, it would not surprise me that short answer questions, really short answer questions, could benefit from AI as to their marking, because I think that's going to be a future. So the burden on individual teachers to mark them might be alleviated somewhat by artificial intelligence, which is rapidly.
And when Ollie was saying very short, in the UK they've been experimenting with very short answer questions, VSAQs. You'll see some papers written by Amir Sam and others about that. And I think there's less room for misunderstanding by the students there about what questions being asked, and at most the students have to write 2 or 3 words, but at least they're creating that answer rather than just recognizing it. So I think it's too early to say whether it would have the same educational impact, but it's going to be marked more easily, can be marked by machine actually, and maybe therefore will improve in reliability. So whether that's going to be the best way forward, we'll see.
Thank you so much for your presentations. Fabio D'Agostino from Unicamillus School of Nursing. And my question is for you, and if you have any experience about the interprofessional education, and if yes, how you organize this, because this year we had an experience of interprofessional education here at Unicamillus University. Thanks to an American colleague, we organized this in a full day with students from medicine, nursing, dental students, physiotherapy, and probably I forget one, midwifery students too. Thank you.
Okay, so I have some experience. The experience I had many years ago was not such a good one, because I think what I would say is it takes a very long time to plan these sessions, doesn't? Nodding enthusiastically. And so the amount of time that you have to put in just to find out who the players are as in planning, and then getting the time and all the rest. And we had planned what I thought would be a really good session on discharge planning. So hoped that it would be medical students, nursing, physios, social care workers, occupational therapists. But the people that were, the other students that were sent to the medical school were diagnostic radiographers. So it completely fell flat. So that's just a word of warning that you've really got to get the right people round the table and get the students bought into the idea. But I do remain enthusiastic about it and have had some good experience in Aston. But fortunately, there within the same college, we had pharmacists, optometrists, and we're now just starting nursing and physician associates as well as medicine. And the whole college are bought into the idea of interprofessional education. So I think it'll improve in the coming years. What we've done in the last few years is think about prescribing and maybe the mode of drug that we give to patients and how patients manage that. That was with our pharmacy students. We've also worked with students across the healthcare professions on more ethical issues and cultural issues. So I think it's thinking about the planning and the time, thinking about the students that you have available, matching them for grade, level of experience, and giving them realistic challenges and not things that are just a waste of one section's time. And I would like to think that we'll go back to maybe discharge planning, because I think that would be a really challenging exercise for all our new students at Aston Medical School. So I don't know if that helps, but that just is a reflection of our experience.
I can give you one example that we have done for a while, and it is called Interprofessional Learning Ward. So as I mentioned in my talk, actually, our medical students at the end of medical school have a long clerkship where they are the primary care provider for a limited number of patients which are not too complex. So we did an experiment actually for a while, having that not only the medical students care for that, but also nursing students. So there was actually an interprofessional student ward, and every day they would have meetings in the morning and the afternoon. Those meetings were all supervised, so you would have like the backbench would be the supervisors, but the students would actually determine what would happen with the patients. And so that was very much appreciated, and unfortunately the one who actually all organized that passed away, and so it is not operational at this moment. But I know my school, I'm now retired from my school, but my school is actually picking that up and going to invest a lot also in interprofessional education. And I think the interprofessional learning ward will come back to. That's for senior medical students together with senior nursing students and some others. I think it's physical therapy too, that's also included.
Thank you.
Thank you. Any other question? So if I may summarize very, very, very quickly, I would say that we had many input and many information. And I thank our speaker. They were really useful and competent and great. I think if we want to take a take-home message, I would summarize it on active learning. We have to stimulate our students to work every single lecture first, to capture their attention with any means. I say first. Second, we can use, I think, online contact. During the COVID and the lockdown, we ran an international course on a European program online, making together a group of students who worked on a case, and these students were one in Italy, one in France, and one somewhere else. It worked. Of course, they said they would have rather stayed in Rome or in Paris than in their own room, but it works. So there are many systems that can be used to implement or to expand the activity of student and to be used in order to make our teaching more active and more useful to the student. And what we learned and we were forced to do during the lockdown, I think may have to remain as a tool to teach and a tool to learn for the student. This is the second. Third, of course, we have to work on the assessment. Absolutely, we have to improve our question, multi-choice, single best answer, short answer. There's a lot to study on that, and we have to concentrate on that in order to make our exam more effective and more toward professionalization and skills. And finally, my hope and the invitation to the audience is to identify a group of teachers willing to work together to build up a little, group for curriculum development and for medical education. A group of teachers that with whom to share this thinking and this learning, because we have to learn a lot. Maybe to take advantage of international courses of medical education. A group of teachers engaged in this field in order to improve the teaching of Unicamillus and making Unicamillus an excellence. We are young, we have young power by the young teachers and academics. We can do a lot. We can do a lot of good in this field. With that, I thank you very much for your participation, and I wish you a good starting of the semester, which will be Monday. Thank you, and thank you to our guests.
I'm sorry. No. I want just to conclude with a few words, no more. And of course, I agree with Federica, and I want also to thank you because I am very so proud to have you here, and for also the high quality of your presentation. And so I want just to remember that it is so important to remember that effectively the medical education is so important thing. It plays a so crucial and important role in the production, in producing competent health care professionals. And the medical education is also a so high dynamic process that needs to be refined, to be changed also periodically, but also I say continuously. And for this reason, we have that the traditional teaching methods that we are so accustomed to use are being supplemented and replaced by advanced and innovative techniques in order to make the medical curricula adequate to take a significant step into the future. So we know, we have just seen also today that we have at this moment a lot of different and important new methodologies to ameliorate our teaching methods, to our teaching job. And remember that all of these new and modern technologies, I think that they will be utilized more and more. The optimal end results will come not only from I can say the focused preparation of the faculty, that now we'll be able so to modulate the utilization of the various learning methods that we have just discussed, but also considering and taking into account the individual and this is important, also the cultural learning differences, enabling so the students to expand a lot their thinking and professional knowledge, improving the logical and critical thinking, the clinical reasoning, and at least, but not the least, of course, the time management. So the early production and introduction of these integrative approaches will develop the student competence and the leadership. And I hope so, they are able to prepare them for a smooth transition from the academics to the clinical practice. No more. Thank you very much again.
Beh, è giunto il momento del caffè allora. Bene. Grazie a tutti, a presto.